My father left me trapped in my bedroom during an earthquake while he saved his guitar collection. I showed him what abandonment felt like. My father Richard left me inside the house during an earthquake while he saved himself and his precious vintage guitar collection, running outside screaming about his investments while I was trapped in my second-floor bedroom with a jammed door. The house was shaking violently, and I could hear things crashing downstairs. But Richard's only concern was getting his 12 guitars out to the lawn, where they'd be safe from potential damage. He actually ran past my bedroom door 3 times carrying guitar cases while I screamed for help because my door frame had shifted and trapped me inside. He heard me yelling but shouted back that I should duck under my desk like we'd practiced while he secured the valuable items that couldn't be replaced. He said insurance would cover injuries but wouldn't cover his 1965 Gibson that was worth more than my college fund. I listened to him make 6 trips for guitars, 2 trips for his vinyl collection, and 1 trip for his signed baseball memorabilia, while I sat under a desk in a room where the ceiling was cracking above me. When the shaking stopped, Richard finally came to check on me, but only after he'd counted all his guitars to make sure none were missing. He had to call the fire department to get my door open, because the frame had completely warped during the quake. The firefighters were horrified when Richard explained he'd prioritized objects over his 15-year-old daughter, and one of them actually asked if I needed alternative housing for my safety. Richard laughed and said I was being dramatic about a little shake when nothing bad had actually happened to me. He told the neighbors who'd gathered outside that his quick thinking had saved hundreds of thousands in vintage instruments, while I'd just panicked like a typical teenager. He posted online about successfully protecting his investments during a natural disaster, with tips for other collectors, while never mentioning that his child had been trapped. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought me cookies and said she couldn't believe a father would save guitars before checking on his daughter, but Richard said she didn't understand the value of rare instruments. When I confronted Richard about leaving me to potentially die, he said I was old enough to handle myself, and his guitars couldn't self-evacuate like I could. He said a good daughter would understand that family assets needed protection, and I should be proud he'd saved our financial future. He actually said if the ceiling had collapsed on me, at least we'd have had the guitars to sell for medical bills, so really he'd been thinking of me the whole time. He explained that the guitars were an investment in my inheritance, and saving them was basically saving my future wealth. He said emotional reactions to earthquakes were temporary, but financial losses were permanent. That's when I decided Richard needed to learn what it felt like to be abandoned, when he needed help most. I started with small emergencies where I'd prioritize everything except him. When he got food poisoning from bad seafood, I told him I needed to grocery shop for fresh food first, since spoiled food was what caused the problem. I left him vomiting for 3 hours while I carefully selected organic vegetables that wouldn't make anyone sick. When he called begging for medicine, I said I was comparing prices at different pharmacies to save money, just like he'd taught me to prioritize finances. When he fell off a ladder cleaning gutters and couldn't get up, I said I needed to secure all the other ladders first, so nobody else would get hurt. He lay on the ground for an hour, while I methodically checked every ladder in the neighborhood for safety compliance. His ankle was swollen, but I reminded him that bones heal, but poorly maintained ladders could cause permanent liability issues. When his car broke down on the highway at night, I told him I needed to ensure my car was running properly first before risking a rescue mission. He waited 4 hours for a tow truck while I got my oil changed and tires rotated. He said I was his daughter and should help him immediately, but I said good fathers didn't leave daughters trapped during earthquakes, so we were even. The real test came when Richard's basement flooded during a storm, while his guitars were down there for a humidity-controlled environment he'd built. He called me frantically begging for help moving the instruments before water damage destroyed them. I told him I needed to check on my apartment plants first, since living things took priority over objects. I drove to his house but sat outside for an hour watering my portable plant collection, while he tried to carry 12 guitars up slippery stairs alone. He fell twice and damaged 2 guitars in the process, but I was busy ensuring my ferns had proper moisture. By the time I finally entered to help, water had reached 6 guitars and the vintage Gibson was completely soaked through. Richard's knees hit the wet concrete and his hands grabbed at the Gibson like he could somehow push the water back out. The sound coming from him wasn't normal crying, but this ugly gasping noise that made my stomach twist even though I'd planned this whole thing. Water dripped from the sound hole when he tilted the guitar, and I watched him try 3 times to wipe it dry with his shirt, before he seemed to understand that wiping wouldn't fix warped wood. His collection sat in puddles around him, 6 guitars with water damage that would cost more than a car to repair, and 2 more that he'd dropped on the stairs trying to save them alone. I stood at the top of the basement steps still holding my watering can with dirt under my fingernails from my ferns. Richard looked up at me and his face did something I'd never seen before. This complete collapse where all his usual confidence just disappeared and left behind something raw and broken. He knew. I could see in his eyes that he understood I'd sat outside watering plants while his guitars drowned, that I'd heard him calling for help and chosen to ignore it the same way he'd run past my bedroom door during the earthquake. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Just more of that gasping sound, and then he managed to say my name like a question. I walked down the stairs slowly because my heart was doing this weird pounding thing that felt like triumph mixed with something heavier. Each step made a wet sound, and I could smell the basement smell of old concrete, plus the sharper smell of water damage on expensive wood. Richard's hands shook when he picked up the Les Paul and tried to wipe water off the frets, but I could see moisture inside the body through the pickup cavities. The finish was already starting to cloud in spots where water had sat too long. He turned the guitar over and water literally poured out of it onto his lap, and that's when he made this sound like someone had punched him. I reached the bottom step and stood there watching him try to save what couldn't be saved anymore. His voice cracked when he asked why I didn't help sooner, why I'd let this happen when he'd called me 4 times begging for help. I set my watering can down on the concrete and told him I was making sure my ferns had proper moisture, that living things come first. Just like he'd made sure his guitars were safe while I was trapped in my room with the ceiling cracking above me during the earthquake. The words came out flat and calm even though my insides felt like they were shaking. Richard set the Les Paul down in the water and just stared at me for what felt like 5 full minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. His face showed actual hurt instead of his usual dismissive expression where he'd tell me I was being dramatic or didn't understand the value of things. He said he understood now, that he got what I was trying to teach him, that being abandoned, when you need help most, feels exactly like this helpless feeling of watching something you care about get destroyed while the person who could help just stands there. His voice sounded different, smaller, without the confidence that usually filled up every room he entered. I expected to feel satisfied hearing him finally admit what he'd done to me, expected some kind of victory or relief or closure. Instead, I just felt empty and kind of sick. Watching him sit there with his ruined guitars didn't make the memory of being trapped during the earthquake hurt any less. It didn't give me back the feeling of safety I'd lost when my own father chose objects over me. The revenge I'd planned so carefully just left me standing in a flooded basement feeling hollow. Mrs. Henderson knocked on our front door about an hour later, and I heard her calling through the mail slot asking if everything was okay, because she'd heard Richard yelling. I climbed the basement stairs and let her in, and she took one look at my face, then at the open basement door where Richard was still sitting in the water, and her expression changed from worried to understanding. She walked to the basement entrance and looked down at the scene, at Richard surrounded by damaged guitars and puddles, at me standing there with my watering can still on the floor where I'd left it. She came back up and closed the basement door and told Richard through it that sometimes people need to experience exactly what they did to others before they can really understand the harm they caused. Her voice was gentle but firm. Then she turned to me and said something about revenge often costing the person seeking it more than they expect, that getting even doesn't usually make people feel better the way they think it will. She didn't say I was wrong for what I'd done, but she looked at me with this sad, knowing expression, like she'd seen this kind of thing before, and knew how it ended. Richard spent the next 2 days in the basement trying to salvage whatever he could from the damaged guitars. I heard him down there at all hours, even at 2 in the morning, working in silence except for occasional sounds of frustration. I stayed in my room mostly, doing homework and scrolling through my phone and trying not to think about the look on his face when he'd realized what I'd done. The vintage Gibson was completely ruined according to the repair shop he called. The wood warped beyond any fix. The electronics destroyed. The whole thing basically firewood now. The other 5 water-damaged guitars would cost over $40,000 to repair, and even then they'd never sound the same or be worth what they were before. I heard Richard on the phone with his insurance company and listened to him find out that his policy had a flood exclusion clause because he'd never thought to add that coverage. He'd been so focused on protecting his guitars from theft and fire that he'd never considered water damage. His financial future and my inheritance that he'd talked about so much were actually destroyed because of his own mistake in not getting proper coverage. On the 3rd day after the flood, Richard came to my bedroom door and knocked quietly instead of just walking in like he usually did. His voice sounded different when he asked if we could talk, lacking all his usual confidence and certainty. We sat in the living room on opposite ends of the couch with this awkward space between us, and neither of us said anything for several minutes. I counted the seconds in my head and got to 143 before he finally spoke. He said he was wrong to leave me trapped during the earthquake, that no possession was worth more than his daughter's safety, that he should have checked on me first before even thinking about his guitars. The apology sounded genuine but also kind of rehearsed, like he'd practiced what to say but didn't fully feel it yet in the way that would actually change him. I told him that understanding something in your head isn't the same as actually feeling it in your bones, that knowing you did something wrong isn't the same as really getting why it was wrong. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully understand what I meant. Richard's sister Magdalena showed up 4 days later after driving from 2 states away. She was the first family member who'd visited since the earthquake 3 months ago, and I'd almost forgotten what she looked like. She hugged Richard for a long time in the driveway, and then came inside and hugged me too. After she'd been there for about an hour, she pulled me aside into my room and closed the door, and asked what really happened with the basement flood. Her eyes searched my face in this way that made me feel like she already knew, but wanted to hear it from me. I told her everything, starting with the earthquake and Richard leaving me trapped, while he saved his guitars, then the food poisoning incident and the ladder fall and the highway breakdown, and finally the flood where I sat outside watering plants while his guitars got destroyed. I expected her to be angry or disappointed, but instead she said she understood why I did it, even though she wished I'd found another way to make Richard see what he'd done. She said revenge made sense when you were hurt that badly, but that it usually created new problems instead of solving old ones. Magdalena sat Richard down in the kitchen and told me to go to my room, and I wasn't invited to join their conversation. I could hear their voices through the walls for over 2 hours, sometimes quiet and sometimes raised, with long periods of silence in between. I tried to do homework, but mostly just sat on my bed listening to the rise and fall of their discussion, without being able to make out specific words. When Magdalena finally came out, she looked tired and sat on my bed and told me that Richard was starting to understand that his obsession with material things had damaged his relationship with his only child, possibly beyond repair. She said he wanted to make amends but didn't know how, that he was lost and confused about what to do next. Then she asked me what I actually needed from him now that the revenge was complete. I opened my mouth to answer but realized I had no idea what to say. I sat there on my bed trying to figure out what I needed from Richard, and came up with nothing. Getting revenge didn't give me the closure I'd expected, and now I was just left with guilt over destroying things he loved, which made me no better than him abandoning me when I was scared. The satisfaction I'd felt watching his guitars get ruined had lasted maybe 10 minutes before turning into this heavy, uncomfortable feeling in my chest. Magdalena suggested family therapy, and I immediately felt my whole body tense up at the idea of sitting in a room with Richard, trying to explain my feelings to some stranger who didn't know us. I told her I needed time to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with a father who'd proved he valued objects more than his daughter's life. She nodded and said that was fair, that I didn't owe Richard forgiveness just because he was sorry now, that healing happens on my timeline, not his. Richard tried to reach out over the following week with small gestures that felt awkward and forced. He made my favorite meals even though I'd never actually told him what my favorite meals were, so he just guessed. He offered to drive me places I didn't need to go. He asked about my day at the school in this careful way like he was reading from a script. Everything felt fake and uncomfortable, like he was performing the role of good father without actually knowing how to be one. I responded with polite distance, answering his questions with short responses that weren't warm enough to encourage him, but weren't cold enough to start another fight. Mrs. Henderson watched our interactions from her yard when I was outside getting the mail, and later caught me by the fence and told me that healing from betrayal takes much longer than the betrayal itself took to happen. She said I shouldn't feel pressured to forgive before I was ready, that forgiveness wasn't something anyone could rush or force, that it had to come naturally or not at all. The insurance adjuster showed up 4 days after the flood and spent 2 hours in our basement with a clipboard and camera, while Richard followed him around explaining the value of each damaged guitar. The adjuster kept nodding politely, but his face stayed completely blank the whole time, and when he finally sat down at our kitchen table to go over the policy, he pointed to a section about flood exclusions that Richard had apparently never bothered to read. Richard argued for 20 minutes about how this was technically water damage from a storm, not a flood, but the adjuster just kept tapping the same paragraph with his pen, until Richard finally went quiet. After the adjuster left, Richard sat at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, adding up numbers on a calculator and crossing things out in his checkbook. I walked past on my way to get water, and saw the total he'd circled at the bottom of the page, $63,000 in guitar value that insurance wouldn't cover. And he just stared at that number like it might change if he looked at it long enough. Over the next week, I heard him on the phone canceling things. First a guitar show in Nashville he'd been planning for months, then withdrawing his bid from some online auction for a vintage Martin. He stopped checking guitar forums and took down the calendar where he'd marked upcoming estate sales and collector meetups. I thought watching him give up his hobby would feel satisfying, like I'd finally won something back from him. But instead, I just felt tired and empty, like we'd both lost something important, and neither of us could get it back. 2 weeks after the flood, I came home from the school and found the basement door open, which was weird because Richard had been keeping it locked since the insurance adjuster left. I walked down the stairs and the whole space was empty, just concrete floor and bare walls where his humidity-controlled setup used to be. The shelves were gone, the temperature monitors were gone, all the guitar stands were gone. Richard was in the kitchen when I came back upstairs, and he told me he'd moved everything that survived to a storage unit across town, that he was done keeping his collection in the house where it could get damaged again. He said he was done prioritizing objects over people, and he said it in this flat voice like he was reading from a script someone had given him. I wanted to believe he meant it, that he'd actually learned something from losing his guitars the same way I'd been trapped during the earthquake, but the words felt hollow because he only changed after it cost him everything. He'd needed to lose $60,000 and watch his daughter deliberately abandon him before he could understand what he'd done to me, and that realization didn't make me feel better about anything. Magdalena started calling me every few days to check in, asking how things were going at home and if Richard and I were talking yet. For the first few calls, I just gave her short answers about how we were fine and everything was getting better, but during one call, I completely broke down crying about how the revenge hadn't fixed anything. I told her I kept thinking about the vintage Gibson sitting in floodwater while I watered my plants outside, and how I couldn't take back what I'd done even though I wasn't sure I wanted to. She let me cry for a while before saying anything, and then she told me that recognizing the cost of revenge was part of growing up, that I could acknowledge my actions were harmful, while still maintaining that what Richard did during the earthquake was worse. She said both things could be true at the same time, that I was justified in my anger, but that the way I'd expressed it had created new wounds instead of healing the old ones. She said some damage can't be undone. We just have to figure out how to live with what we've done and what's been done to us. After that call, I felt slightly less heavy. Like maybe I didn't have to choose between being right about the earthquake and being wrong about the flood. Like maybe I could just hold both feelings at the same time. Richard and I fell into this weird pattern where we lived in the same house but barely interacted, like roommates who'd signed a lease together but didn't actually like each other. He stopped mentioning guitars completely, didn't talk about music or collectors or anything related to his old hobby. I stopped bringing up the earthquake or making comments about how he'd abandoned me. We ate dinner at different times, watched TV in separate rooms, and only spoke when we needed to coordinate schedules or discuss house stuff. Mrs. Henderson noticed the change and started inviting me over for dinner twice a week, giving me a space where I could actually relax without feeling the weight of everything that had happened between Richard and me. She never asked me to forgive him faster, or told me I should try harder to rebuild our relationship. She just let me sit at her table and eat her cooking and talk about school and normal stuff that had nothing to do with earthquakes or revenge. 3 months after the flood, Richard knocked on my bedroom door and asked if I wanted to learn to drive. He said he'd been thinking about it and I was old enough to start practicing and he could teach me if I wanted. I stared at him for a minute trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap or manipulation, but his face just looked tired and genuine. I said okay cautiously, and we started going out to empty parking lots on weekends where he'd let me practice turning and parking and basic stuff. He was patient when I made mistakes, never raised his voice when I hit the curb or stalled the engine, just calmly explained what I should do differently next time. During those driving lessons, I caught glimpses of what a normal father-daughter relationship might look like, the kind where a parent teaches their kid something new without making it about their own issues or priorities. It felt strange and uncomfortable at first, like we were both pretending to be different people, but after a few weeks it started feeling almost natural. During one lesson while I was practicing highway merging, Richard told me he'd been seeing a therapist to work through his obsession with material possessions and his failure as a father during the earthquake. He didn't ask me to forgive him or congratulate him for getting help. He just stated it like a fact, the same way he might mention he'd gone to the dentist or gotten an oil change. I kept my eyes on the road and told him I was glad he was getting help, and we drove in silence for the rest of the hour. The silence felt comfortable instead of awkward, like we'd reached some kind of understanding that we didn't need to fill every moment with words or apologies or explanations. When we got home, he thanked me for driving carefully and went inside without making a big deal out of his therapy announcement. I started spending more time with friends and focusing on my own life, instead of monitoring everything Richard did, or planning new ways to make him understand what abandonment felt like. My grades went up because I was actually doing homework instead of plotting revenge scenarios. I joined the school photography club and discovered I was pretty good at taking pictures of random stuff around the neighborhood. I started researching colleges and making plans for applications that didn't factor in Richard's guitar collection as some kind of inheritance I'd eventually receive. Mrs. Henderson noticed the change when I came over for dinner one night and told me I seemed lighter, like I'd put down some heavy thing I'd been carrying around for months. She was right. I had put something down. I just wasn't sure yet what I'd picked up to replace it. Richard and I had our first real conversation in months when he asked about my college plans during dinner one night. Usually when we ate at the same time, we just sat there in silence. But this time he actually asked questions and listened to my answers without making everything about finances or his lost guitar investments. I told him I was thinking about state schools because they were cheaper and had good programs for what I wanted to study. He nodded and then told me he'd started a college fund with the money he would have spent on guitars, and while it wasn't much yet, he was putting money in regularly. The gesture felt more meaningful than all his earlier apologies because it was actual sustained action instead of just words. He showed me the bank statements without me asking, proving he was really doing it, and I felt something shift slightly in how I saw him. 6 months after the earthquake, neither of us mentioned the anniversary directly, but Richard made my favorite dinner, and we ate together at the table instead of in separate rooms. The conversation was still kind of stilted, and we avoided certain topics like we were walking around landmines, but it was progress compared to the cold distance we'd maintained for months. We talked about normal stuff like school and work and what was happening in the neighborhood. I realized while we were eating that our relationship would never be what it was before the earthquake, because we'd both seen the worst parts of each other, the parts that prioritized self-interest over family. But maybe we could build something different, something more honest that acknowledged our flaws instead of pretending they didn't exist. Magdalena visited again and spent time observing how Richard and I interacted, watching us move around each other in the kitchen and make small talk about groceries. She pulled me aside later and told me she was proud of the work we were both doing, even though it was messy and incomplete. She took me shopping, and while we were looking at clothes, she told me that some family relationships can't be fully repaired. They can only be rebuilt into something new that acknowledges the damage while moving forward. She said I didn't have to have the father I wanted. I just had to decide what kind of relationship I was willing to have with the father I actually had. I tried on a jacket and looked at myself in the mirror and thought about how I was starting to accept that Richard would never be the dad who'd risk everything to save me. But maybe he could be the dad who'd learn from his mistakes and try to do better, and maybe that was enough. Richard started selling his guitars 2 weeks after our driving lesson conversation, listing them one by one on collector websites and forums where serious buyers gathered. I watched him photograph each instrument carefully, write detailed descriptions of their history and condition, and respond to messages from interested people across the country. He didn't announce what he was doing or make a big show of it, just quietly dismantled the collection he'd spent 20 years building. The sales happened over 3 months, with guitars shipping out in their cases to new owners, while Richard deposited checks into accounts I didn't ask about. One afternoon, he called me into the kitchen where he had bank statements spread across the table, and he showed me the college fund account with my name on it that now had enough money to cover 4 years at a state school with some left over for living expenses. He'd also paid for the repairs to the house that insurance hadn't covered after the earthquake, fixing the warped door frames and ceiling cracks that had been constant reminders of that day. I looked at the numbers on the statements and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that he was actually doing something instead of just talking about change. He kept one guitar, an old acoustic that had belonged to his father, and when I asked why that one, he said some things were about memory instead of money. I told him that was good, and the words came out flat and honest without any extra emotion attached, which felt right for where we actually were, instead of where we might have wanted to be. A year after the earthquake, I submitted my college applications to schools that were 3 to 4 hours away, far enough that I'd have my own life, but close enough that distance wouldn't be an excuse if I decided to visit. Richard looked over the list when I showed him and nodded his approval without trying to push me towards schools closer to home or suggesting I should stay nearby to save money on housing. We'd settled into a pattern where we coexisted in the house like roommates who respected each other's space, sharing meals a few times a week and having surface-level conversations about weather and schedules and what needed fixing around the property. The relationship wasn't close and probably never would be, but it was functional in a way that felt sustainable for both of us. I still thought about the earthquake sometimes, about sitting under my desk listening to him save guitars while the ceiling cracked above me, and I knew that memory would always be there, creating a barrier between us. Richard carried his own scars from the flood, visible in how he avoided the basement and never mentioned his destroyed guitar collection, even when music came up in conversation. We'd both learned hard lessons about what happened when you prioritized objects over people and revenge over healing, and while we hadn't found some perfect reconciliation, we'd figured out how to exist in the aftermath without destroying each other further. It wasn't the fairy tale ending where everything got fixed and we became the perfect father and daughter, but it was real and honest, and maybe that was worth more than pretending the damage had never happened.